Thanks to Lumen for sponsoring this episode. The warmer months are coming. Spring back into your health and fitness. Go to lumen.me/hopeful to get 15% off your Lumen. That is lumen.me/hopeful for 15% off your purchase. And thanks to Shopify for supporting Future Hindsight. Shopify is a platform designed for anyone to sell anywhere, giving entrepreneurs like myself the resources once reserved for big business. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/hopeful, all lowercase. Have you signed up for the Future Hindsight newsletter yet? Let us help you build your Civic Action Toolkit. We'll come to you every week with everything you need to be the spark. Sign up at futurehindsight.com right after the episode. All right, let's get to it. Welcome to Future Hindsight, a podcast on a mission to spark civic action. I'm your host, Mila Atmos. I'm a global citizen based in New York City, and I'm deeply curious about the way our society works. So each week I bring you conversations to cut through the confusion around today's most important civic issues and share clear, actionable ways for us to build a brighter future together. After all, democracy is not a spectator sport. Tomorrow starts right now. In moments of democratic crisis, the solutions often emerge not from the halls of power, but from the grassroots wisdom of ordinary citizens. The story of citizenship schools represents one of the most profound yet understudied chapters in American democracy, a chapter that offers critical lessons for our present moment. To dig into the history of citizenship schools and their profound importance in the civil rights movement, I'm joined by Elaine Weiss. She's a journalist, public speaker, and the author of Spell Freedom, the underground schools that built the civil rights movement. She's also the author of The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote, which was a source for the Broadway musical SUFFS. Welcome, Elaine. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's start with how you came to write this book. It seems perfect timing for this time, like spring of 2025. But of course, you must have been working on this for some time. So what prompted you to write this book?
Yes, I could not have foreseen that the book would arrive at this moment, but I think it is a fortunate thing that it has. I began research on this topic in 2019, so quite a few years ago. I had just published The Woman's Hour, which is a story of how American women fought for 7 decades to win the right to vote, and all the obstacles they had to face and all the kinds of opposition, including racial opposition, that they had to maneuver around for those 70 years. And as I spoke on this about the book around the country, I'd have to explain that, yes, the 19th Amendment gave all American women citizens over the age of 21 the constitutional right to vote. But in the Jim Crow South, Black women were still prevented from voting for another 45 years, just as Black men were prevented from voting after they were accorded the vote by the 15th Amendment in 1870. So the state's Jim Crow laws prevented Black women and Black men from voting. And I decided I really needed to delve more deeply into how that happened and how it was overcome. So I realized that the next great suffrage battle, we usually use suffrage as just the women's vote, but suffrage means the right to vote. And so the great next expansion of our democracy was the civil rights movement and the demand to reclaim the voting rights that Black Americans already had, but were not able to exercise. And so in my exploration of that part of our history that should be well known and spoken about constantly is how do we go from a self-professed democratic nation that doesn't allow more than half of its citizens to vote, and then how we have overcome it.
You start the book actually with Brown v. Education, the landmark Supreme Court decision in 1954 that struck down segregated schools and spelled the beginning of the end of Jim Crow laws in the South. So why did you start there? Because, of course, this book is about voting and suffrage.
I begin the book on the day that the Brown decision is announced by the Supreme Court, and that's May 17th, 1954. And it's not that the struggle for civil rights or voting rights begins on that day. It's been continuous. But the Brown decision becomes a catalyst. It becomes that moment when communities and organizations realize that something is different now. The highest court in the land has said separate is not equal. Since 1895 and the Plessy decision, the Southern states have been imposing these separate but equal, supposedly, laws on the Black citizenry. And this marks a change. And everyone understands that this decision isn't just about desegregating K through 12 public schools, which is its specific mandate, but it gives an opening to challenge all segregation restrictions. And so that moment is a spark. And I look at the characters that the reader is going to follow through the movement on that day, because it does change people's internal understanding of what they can do. It's a great catalyst.
Yeah. I mean, the way that you wrote about it in the book, and it had never occurred to me how that Supreme Court decision unlocked the possibilities for democratic participation for Black people in the South. So, of course, that didn't come around all on its own. It had to be fought for and organized for. But just to set the stage, exactly what is the power of voting? And especially in those days, why was voting so important?
In the abstract, voting is an American's participation in government by and for the people. It's the expression of our national idea. The nation is founded on that idea. Of course, it leaves out women, Black people, Native people, but it does at least profess the idea that we are going to be a nation that governs itself and the people are going to decide. And to be left out of that, to be a second-class citizen, means that you're not participating. You're not being allowed to participate in that. On a more practical, everyday level, it means you have no power. If our government is based on elected representatives, which it is, both at the national level and at the state and local level, going down to, townships, then if you can't vote, you have no voice in the laws that rule you, in the execution of those laws, in the allocation of resources. You have no power. And so when you think of it, entire communities have no power if they cannot vote.
Right, right. Well, enter citizenship schools. They were explicitly formed to build political power for the Black communities under Jim Crow so that they could make desegregation real, not just in schools, but in society overall. And I actually had learned about Septima Clark and citizenship schools only recently, like last winter. So when your book crossed our desks, we thought, well, we really have to have this conversation and find out more. So tell us a little bit more about how citizenship schools came to be formed.
Well, it's this really beautiful story of four really ordinary people. And it starts on a remote sea island off the coast of Charleston. And the idea begins with a man named Esau Jenkins, who has a fourth grade formal education, though he's gone back to night school. He's very clever, very entrepreneurial, very much a civic leader on his island. And he realizes his neighbors, his island is impoverished, is neglected, is under the thumb of white domination in the courts, in the police, in who gets electricity, who gets a road paved. And he knows that they will remain isolated and poor unless they can muster some political muscle. And so he wants to get his neighbors to vote. But most of them are illiterate. So most of his neighbors can't vote, but they also can't read and write. But he wants them to learn to pass the literacy tests, which were imposed in the southern states as a barrier, as a way to disenfranchise Black citizens. These tests were supposedly to be administered to both Black and white registrants. Of course, it was only Black registrants who really had to do them. They were totally ridiculous. College graduates didn't pass because they were very subjective. They were, literally how many jelly beans in a jar, but also having to interpret the Constitution of the state, which is written in archaic language. So what Esau Jenkins does, one of his many entrepreneurial businesses, he drives a bus back and forth in the morning and the evening to take his neighbors to their work on the mainland in Charleston as domestic workers, as factory workers in the shipyards. And he has a captive audience and he lectures to them about how important it is to vote and the beauty of democracy and how they are entitled to first-class citizenship. So he gives them these pep talks. And then he has his wife type up the state constitution of South Carolina and pass it around. And they discuss it on the way to and from every morning and evening. And he gets some people prepared and accompanies them to the courthouse to try to register. And this is going slowly, but well. And after the Brown decision in the summer of 1954, he goes to a place in Tennessee called the Highlander Folk School. And he's enticed to go there by his friend and one-time teacher, a woman named Septima Clark, who is also an activist. I should say both Esau and Septima Clark are activists on the board of the NAACP of Charleston.
So even before citizenship school, they were already activists.
Yes. Septima Clark joined the NAACP in 1918.
Wow.
And she has been a community activist
right.
all her life.
Right. Well, so to be clear, organizing in this way was really dangerous. In fact, registering to vote was dangerous. And when we think about voter suppression today, primarily in the form of having to produce ID, right, a driver's license or a birth certificate in some instances, we're really missing how brutal it used to be. What were the consequences of registering to vote at that time?
They were severe. And just attempting to register to vote, which did not mean you could actually end up voting, but just attempting to register. Let's say you had studied at one of these citizenship schools, and we'll talk about what they actually taught, and you get up the nerve to register. You go to the courthouse, and the registrar, who's a white registrar in almost every instance, says you failed. No matter what you do, you failed. But by the time you return home, she has called, or he has called, your landlord, and you and your family will very well be evicted from your home, from your rented home, from your sharecropper's shack. Your boss would have been notified and you'd be fired. Your name would be posted on the courthouse and you'd become a target for the Klan, and night riders would come by your house or your shack and shoot it up. You'd also be subjected to something called the squeeze, which meant that no merchants in town would sell you food. The pharmacy wouldn't fulfill your prescription for your sick child. You were totally squeezed. And very often you were killed. That was not unheard of by any means. And so to take this risk was extraordinary. And it meant that you are a marked person in your town. And I think we forget the strength it took, the courage it took to even attempt to vote, because the vote meant so much. It meant you were a citizen. It meant you were equal. And tens and hundreds of thousands of people were willing to do this. And in many cases, they were strengthened by what they learned and the courage they took from these citizenship schools.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, in this year, 2025, it's almost inconceivable just how much courage this took for everyday people to go to citizenship schools, and of course for Esau and Septima to even start it and have this idea that they would organize and get them to register. But tell us a little bit more about how Esau and Septima crossed paths. You mentioned a little bit about that, because here on Future Hindsight, we're committed to inspire civic action in everyday people. And really, I think Esau and Septima are not, they are unusual people. But of course, I think at the time, people would not have thought of them as so unusual. They're just like us. One of them is a grocer. He drives a bus, and Septima was a school teacher. So it's not like they were elected officials or anything like that. But tell us a little bit more about how they came together and then conspired to have this idea.
That's very true. They are ordinary people. And I think that's one of the special aspects of the book, is that ordinary people can do these extraordinary things. And Septima Clark was a school teacher born and raised in Charleston, and she had been teaching for 40 years at that point. And her first assignment, when she's just 18 years old, is on John's Island, Esau's home, which is at that time a very isolated, very poor rural sea island, mostly agricultural. And then when the bridges built after World War II, people are able to go into the mainland, into Charleston. Septima is a real figure for Esau, and they work together later in life. We're now in the 1950s. They're both working in the racial justice movement. They're both on the executive board of the NAACP. And when Septima Clark goes to this Highlander folk school, soon after the Brown decision comes down, that's in May. By June, she's going to this interracial training center in the mountains of Tennessee. And when she comes back, she's just all fired up. And she says, this is the beginning. We can do something now. And she gets Esau to come to Highlander. And, he says, why do I want to go to some mountain in Tennessee? What's that going to do any good? But he, too, gets really captivated by the idea of Black and white people talking together, planning together, strategizing, and really coming up with a plan to implement. The Brown decision was great, but in fact, there was no enforcement mechanism, and there was no deadlines or penalties if you didn't desegregate, which is why it took many, many years after the decision. And so they come together and come up with this idea based on Esau's teaching on the bus, and says, well, maybe we can have something on your island that's a little more stationary anyway. It's not on a bus, but we can teach literacy. And literacy is the key. Literacy helps you become a citizen. And they come together knowing that this is dangerous for them. It's dangerous for the woman who will become the first teacher. It's dangerous for the first students. And they are willing to take that risk. And they're willing all through the next 15 years of the movement to encourage others to take that risk. And it's such an extraordinary step towards autonomy and agency that they encourage. They encourage confidence and skills and agency.
Right.
And that begins to build a movement.
We'll be right back with Elaine Weiss, so stay with us. You won't want to miss this episode's Civic Spark. One small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. But first, did you know that when your metabolism is working properly, you will feel the benefits in literally every aspect of your life? Well, I have found a valuable tool that gives me the insights I need to create a healthy metabolism for my body. It's called Lumen. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. Pretty cool, right? And on the app, Lumen lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs and gives you tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, workouts, sleep, and even stress management. All you have to do is breathe into your Lumen first thing in the morning, and you'll know what's going on with your metabolism. like whether you're burning mostly fats or mostly carbs. Then, Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. And if you really want to put it to work, you can breathe into it before and after workouts and meals, so you know exactly what's going on in your body in real time. And Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. You see, your metabolism is your body's engine. It's how your body turns the food you eat into fuel that keeps you going. And because your metabolism is at the center of everything your body does, optimal metabolic health translates to a bunch of benefits, including easier weight management, improved energy levels, better fitness results, better sleep. I mean, that's the biggest thing I've learned about myself since starting with Lumen. I have now become really disciplined about going to bed earlier and getting more sleep. So, let Lumen give you the recommendations you need to improve your metabolic health. Spring has sprung. The warmer months are coming. So why don't you spring back into your health and fitness? Go to lumen.me/hopeful to get 15% off your Lumen. That is lumen.me/hopeful for 15% off your purchase. Thank you, Lumen, for sponsoring this episode. We also want to tell you about Shopify. Look, starting a business is a lot of work. Rewarding work, of course, yes, but still a lot of work. When Future Hindsight first came to your headphones 8 years ago, it felt like I had to figure the whole thing out all on my own. Whether that was recording and editing the audio, finding great guests, social media, you name it. Every day seemed to introduce another problem that needed a solution. It was a little overwhelming. When you're starting off with something new, it seems like your to-do list just inflates and inflates, filling up with new tasks that can pretty easily overrun your life. So finding the right tool that not only helps you out, but simplifies everything in the process can be such a game changer. For millions of businesses out there, that tool is Shopify. Shopify is the commerce platform behind millions of businesses around the world. And, get this, 10% of all e-commerce in the US. From household names like Rare Beauty and Aloe Yoga to brands that are just getting started out there. So get started now with all the tools you could ever need from Shopify, like your own design studio. Because with hundreds of ready-to-use templates, Shopify helps you build a beautiful online store to match your brand's style. Let's say you want to accelerate your content creation. Great. Shopify is packed with helpful AI tools that write product descriptions, page headlines, and even enhance your product photography. With so many helpful tools at your fingertips, you can get the word out as if you have a marketing team behind you, like creating email and social media campaigns wherever your customers are scrolling or strolling. And best yet, Shopify is your commerce expert with world-class experience in everything from managing inventory to international shipping to processing returns and beyond. So listen up. If you're ready to sell, you're ready for Shopify. Because no matter how big you want to grow, Shopify gives you everything you need to take control and take your business to the next level. And that's what I love about Shopify. Turn your big business idea into cha-ching with Shopify on your side. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period and start selling today at shopify.com/hopeful. Go to shopify.com/hopeful. Shopify.com/hopeful. And now, let's return to my conversation with Elaine Weiss. I was really impressed about this grassroots effort by just a few people that has changed the lives of so many. It grew really quite a lot, starting with this one school on Johns Island. Tell us a little bit about the scale of citizenship schools in the end. Like, how many people received a citizenship education, and where did this work end up going? Because, of course, we don't have citizenship schools anymore.
Right. The citizenship education program begins in a grocery store. Septima and Esau Jenkins build a secret classroom behind the shelves of a cooperative grocery store. on John's Island. And there are 14 people who enroll in that first class. It takes place in the winter, which is the laying by time in agricultural work. So these people have some time to be able to come to these night classes that are held twice a week, and there's homework in between. And they have to learn the very basics, like how to hold a pencil, because they've never had to use or known how to use a writing implement before. And they learn to sign their names, which is an enormous psychological boost. Suddenly they don't have to rely on their boss or on their pastor to sign their names for them on any legal document. They don't have to put in X anymore. They learn their letters. They learn to read. They learn some basic arithmetic. And this allows them not only to prepare for the literacy tests, but also there are classes in government and citizenship. And what are your rights? What does the Constitution say your rights are? Even if the Jim Crow laws say you are not entitled to this, you are entitled to this. And so they begin to grow because people on other sea islands hear about it and say, well, we'd like this too. You're beginning to get people to register to vote. And you're teaching people how to read. They want to read their Bibles. They've been memorizing their Bibles. They want to be able to write a letter to their brother who lives in Texas. So there's some very fundamental, everyday tasks that they've never been able to do. But there's also this aspiration that they're going to become first-class citizens. They're going to learn to vote. And so it begins to spread organically. It then goes to the mainland, and there's classes there. It goes to Savannah, where a young organizer named Hosea Williams realizes this could be a real tool for organizing for larger demands, not only the vote, but desegregation. And by 1960, there are dozens and dozens of these. And I want to explain, they're not like schoolhouses. They're not little brick buildings.
Right. They're like in the back rooms of the grocery store.
The grocery store.
Because you don't want to be found out, right?
Exactly.
Because it's so dangerous.
Exactly. So these are kept very quiet. I mean, they're not totally secret because there are people talking about them.
You have to talk about them. Yes,
but it's mostly within the Black community. And the white community in Charleston doesn't realize this is happening. And they begin to spread. And by 1961, the program is transferred to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is Dr. King's organization. And there it begins to really explode and is in all 11 Deep South states. There are estimates, and it's really hard because some of these are really informal. They're in your kitchen. They're in the beauty parlors at night. They're in the funeral parlors at night. And so it's hard to count. And sometimes the records were not kept purposefully, so these people's names weren't known. But the official estimate is that by 1965, when the Voting Rights Act finally is enacted, that more than 900 of these little informal community peer-based classes, they're not taught by outsiders. There aren't young college kids coming to teach these. These were your neighbors who would go and be trained by Septima Clark to be able to teach this curriculum. So these are your neighbors, you trust them, you know they're not going to report you to the white citizens councils. So it's a whole level of community engagement that can only be done really within the community. And 900 of these have taken place in those like 15 years, and tens of thousands of people have gone through it and been trained as teachers, been trained as students, and they then become the local leadership of the civil rights movement, because a movement can't just be Dr. King marching down the street. It had to be prepared. And there's lots of ways they get prepared, but a lot of it funnels through these citizenship classes.
Well, it's good you made that direct connection between literacy and citizenship, because when you think about the attack on public education today, it is in part for this reason, right? Maybe in large part for this reason, that there is a faction of this country that wants to continue to disempower people throughout their lives, and especially at the voting booth. So I want to backtrack a little bit to the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. You said that Septima and Esau went there, and it ended up having a really big influence in rolling out citizenship schools in other places. Tell us a little bit more about the school. Miles Horton founded and ran it, and he was for sure a kindred spirit. He was a white man, but what was taught there? Who attended? And it had, like, I want to say, an outsized influence on organizing writ large in the United States.
Yes, it does. And I want to say right off the bat that it's still going strong. It's still operating in Newmarket, Tennessee, outside of Knoxville, in its 93rd year. But it was begun in 1932 by a young white liberal man in his 20s named Miles Horton, who studied sociology, studied at seminary, and he wanted to help his own impoverished area of Appalachia, where he was born and raised. And he goes back there in the depths of the Depression, and he begins as sort of a residential workshop. It's a place where people can come and talk about their problems and talk about solutions. And it becomes a labor organizing facility. And it brings workers together to talk about how to organize, how to strike if necessary, how to know your rights. And it disseminates the songs of the labor movement. Singing is always a big part of the Highlander experience. So people come from all around the South and people from the North too, academics, labor organizers, laborers. And the thing about Highlanders, you had to go home with a plan for what you were going to do when you got back to your community. And then Highlander would help you implement that. That was what made it work. It wasn't just talk. And around 1950, right after World War II ends, Miles Horton realizes that it's the racial problem that is hindering his beloved Southland to progress either politically, socially, economically. And until they have a reckoning over race, things are not going to be able to progress. And so he pivots the organization, which is funded by grants, and he convinces his board that we're going to tackle civil rights, Black civil rights. That's where we should be. That's the space we should operate in. This Highlander place has always defied Jim Crow laws. It's always been integrated. It exists atop a sundown town in the Cumberland Plateau of southern Tennessee, but it always welcomed both Blacks and whites. And that experience of living together for a week or two in an integrated setting turned out to change lives and build civil rights leaders. And I'll give you a couple of examples. Septima Clark goes there, and when she's assigned a white roommate, she's just agog, both thrilled and terrified. A year later, a middle-aged activist from Montgomery, Alabama comes. Her name is Rosa Macaulay Parks. And 3 months later, she will refuse to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus and spark the Montgomery bus boycott, which is really the first big campaign of the civil rights movement. And she gives Highlander complete credit for stiffening her spine, making her recognize what's possible. And eating with white people, living with white people, talking openly with white people really changes her and fortifies her. A few years later, a young seminarian comes. He's at the American Baptist College in Nashville. He's been studying nonviolent resistance. His name is John Lewis, former congressman. And he says that Highlander set him on fire because he realized that the world could be different. And so Highlander not only inspires by what it does, but what it is, but also it is a way of training and enlarging the vision of these, again, ordinary people who become leaders in their own right.
So I feel like we desperately need this kind of enthusiasm for voting, for being engaged as citizens. Again, whether that's at citizenship schools or at Highlander. But how do you think about the parallels to today? Meaning, what are the things that they did then or talked about then that we really need to practice again today?
I think about this a lot, Mila, because we're in this moment when voting rights are under attack. And perhaps even more distressing to me, large swaths of people are not voting, even if they have the right to vote, even if they're not inhibited in some way, they're choosing not to vote. And I think part of that is a lack of citizen education, because if you think that your government is just this black box and you have no power to influence it, that what you vote isn't going to matter, that what you say isn't going to matter, that letter to your congressman, that call to congressman, not going to matter, or your protest to your mayor or your town council. If you don't know how it works, then it all becomes mysterious and perhaps even conspiratorial and not in your power to affect. And one of the things that the citizenship education program did was teach ordinary people, this is how your town works. This is who to call if you need a street light. This is how the power of a petition could be enacted. And so they learned how to use the structure of government. And I think that because civics aren't taught in schools anymore, for the most part, you really don't know what it is that you can do as a citizen. And so I think people give up and don't take it seriously. So I think that's one part. The other part is to recognize the systemic oppression that these people in the mid 20th century had to endure and overcome. They did. They figured out how to organize on the local level and on the national level, how to pressure the White House, how to pressure Congress. Believe me, those Civil Rights Acts and Voting Rights Act did not come out of thin air. It took more than a decade of fighting. So there are lots of ideas that I think we would do well to remember right now. But the most important is that change begins with the individual, what Septima Clark called being ready from within. And that's a psychological readiness, a spiritual readiness, a political readiness to know what you have to do. And another thing I noticed, I was out with the marchers this weekend, and we need songs. We need songs. We don't have, I was not impressed. Great signs, but not great singing.
Not great singing. We should bring We Shall Overcome back.
Mm-hmm.
At the very least, it's a song that everybody knows, right? It's not foreign to most people. I mean, I think not. So I feel like this conversation would not be complete without discussing McCarthyism and communism. Because, of course, from our vantage point today, it's hard to remember that McCarthyism directly preceded the Brown v. Education decision. So the Red Scare was still fresh, if not alive and well, depending on where you were living. And accusations of being a communist still carried a lot of weight. So what is the argument that anti-communists or, let's say, white supremacists used to oppose civil rights or malign the civil rights movement through communism?
Oh, you're very right. McCarthyism and the Red Scare and using the accusation of being a socialist or a communist was really just a ploy. It was used mostly, almost exclusively, as a smear tactic. And we see it have a very outsized role in opposing civil rights. And I document that really carefully because it had a lot of influence in persecuting Highlander. Highlander is accused of being a communist school, and it's used to close it down at some point and to confiscate its property and its land. Luckily, it pops up and is resilient and keeps going, but it was accused completely without facts of being alien. And communism was used as a term of being un-American. It didn't matter whether it really was a communist philosophy or whatever they thought it was. Again, we hear that today. We hear that right now. Organizations and ideas are called radical, liberal, leftist craziness, or they're called socialists, they're called communists. But what it tries to convey is this is un-American.
Mm-hmm.
And this is alien, and this is not something that is acceptable. And this was used to smear Dr. King in regard to his association with Highlander. The NAACP is accused of being a subversive, leftist, communist organization for years and years and years. And it's actually shut down in the South for crucial years during the movement. And it's actually made illegal in South Carolina, where Septima Clark lives. And she is fired from her job of being a school teacher, where she is taught in that system for 40 years, because she refuses to renounce her membership in the NAACP, and she loses her pension, which is a severe economic blow to her. And she says she will not give in to this. And we see that now.
Mm-hmm.
If you mention DEI, if you belong to certain organizations, you're being targeted. And so I see very frightening echoes of a McCarthyite frame of mind that's being implemented right now. And knowing this history is important, knowing how it is misused as a way of saying the civil rights movement, where Black citizens are demanding their rights, that's un-American. It could not happen organically from the community. It must be coming from an alien source. It's being directed by the Kremlin, which is the way they spoke about it then. And so I think we should be aware of this history because we're seeing echoes of it right now. And I think we should be very, very strong in pushing back.
Well, I think it sounds improbable that this history has essentially been forgotten. And that these, echoes is maybe even an understatement. It's just a repeat, using the same tactics and even the same words in suppressing and in oppressing people of color all across this country and disenfranchising them from voting, defunding public schools. All of it is the same playbook. So every week on Future Hindsight, I ask my guest to share a civic spark, one small step we can all take to be more empowered and ignite collective change. So what's a good way to turn the insights that you've shared with us today into action?
I think I'd like to say we should all start community citizenship schools, basically teach-ins, to teach not only what your rights are and how a citizen has privileges and responsibilities. It's your responsibility to vote, not just your privilege.
Yes.
But also to talk about how to evaluate candidates. One of the things that the citizenship schools did, there was a second step after you graduated and had the basics. You would join a citizens club or a voters club, and there you would have monthly meetings. And you'd actually learn how to evaluate a candidate running for local or regional or national office. And Esau Jenkins used to say, I have to teach that you don't just believe what they're telling you, but you have to look at their record and match it up and make sure they're not promising you something they have no intention of following through on. And that kind of education, which the League of Women Voters still does, but I think it's not being given the attention it should. But that idea of coming together, not just in times of elections, but all through the cycles of saying, this election is important, this is why, and having sort of teach-ins that can bring communities together and regions together to figure out what kind of representation they want and who would best do that.
Yes, that's really good advice. I want to give a shout out here to the Sunrise Movement that does teach-ins on a regular basis. And I recently attended one, and I highly recommend that at the very least attend one that is organized by Sunrise Movement, or organize your own. That would be even better. So, Elaine, looking into the future, what makes you hopeful?
I think realizing what the characters I write about went through, Septima Clark, Esau Jenkins, Bernice Robinson, who becomes one of the first teachers and then teaches the young students of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee how to do education in the field. What they experienced and what the people who were brave enough to step up as volunteer teachers and the people who were organizing in their towns and faced with incredible retribution and punishment and harassment. But they stood strong and they said, as an American, I am entitled to these rights and I am not going to back down. And so one of the things that's really heartened me is getting letters from my readers who've read Spell Freedom. And they say, I'm taking courage from this because I know we've been through this before. We've had to face this kind of oppression of trying to completely erase our history, because that was also, it was illegal to teach Black history in the Jim Crow South. We've been through this. We've managed to figure out how to overcome it. And we've come up with very creative, nonviolent, effective means to regain our votes, to speak the truth, and to get that word out. And so I think I take some comfort in knowing we've been through these kinds of times before, and we've learned how to overcome them, how to become stronger through that adversity, perhaps. And I hope that the lessons we learned from reading about this extraordinary group of ordinary people will give that sense of grassroots, individual strength and creativity a boost, because we certainly need that now.
We definitely do. Thank you so much, Elaine, for joining me on Future Hindsight. It was really a pleasure to have you on the show. And congratulations on your book.
My pleasure being with you. Thanks so much.
Elaine Weiss is a journalist, public speaker, and the author of Spell Freedom, the underground schools that built the civil rights movement. Remember, civic action doesn't have to be complicated. It's about small steps that spark progress, like sharing this episode with a friend. Let's recap this week's Civic Spark and fire up our collective power. Start your own community schools and start small. Share the power of voting with your neighbors. Help others realize why the responsibility of voting is so important. And in a time where outside forces do everything in their power to keep us all separated, it's essential to be in community and come together with people you trust. Next week, our guest is Karen Thompson. She's the legal director of Pregnancy Justice, which advances and defends the rights of pregnant people, no matter if they give birth, experience a pregnancy loss, or have an abortion. No one should lose their rights because of pregnancy.
We've done 3 major studies about pregnancy criminalization. And what we've seen is up until Dobbs, there were over 2,000 cases of pregnancy criminalization in the United States. In the year after Dobbs, we found 200 cases, which is completely off the charts.
That's next time on Future Hindsight. Now, go ahead and hit that follow button on your podcast app. Do you see it? It's right there. This way, you won't miss a single episode of Future Hindsight in your rotation every week. And if you can't get enough of Future Hindsight, you're not alone. Let us jump into your inbox every week. Sign up for the newsletter now at futurehindsight.com. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time, see clearly, act boldly, and spark the change you want to see. This episode was produced by Zack Travis and me.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,